In 1991, a man was stranded in space while his country collapsed below him, and the voice that kept reaching him came from a kitchen table. In the late 20th century, as the Cold War loosened its grip and the political order that had shaped half the world began to fracture, a space station called MIR circled the Earth in quiet persistence. Launched in 1986 by the Soviet Union, MIR was the first modular space station ever built. It was a patchwork of pressurized compartments assembled piece by piece in orbit. It was humanity's longest inhabited home beyond Earth. It was a place of innovation and endurance, but also of isolation, uncertainty, and constant risk. From the ground, MIR appeared as a faint point of light gliding across the night sky. From inside, it was a maze of cables, valves, aging electronics, and improvised repairs. Crews lived there for months at a time, floating through narrow corridors, sleeping strapped to the walls. They conducted experiments in biology, physics, and astronomy, while battling muscle loss and fatigue. Communication with mission control was essential, but it was also formal, technical, and monitored. The cosmonauts could report data, receive instructions, and discuss procedures. What they could not easily access was ordinary human conversation. They missed the casual exchange of daily life, the sound of someone speaking without an agenda, and the reminder that Earth was still full of normal people doing normal things. That gap would be filled not by an agency or a government program, but by a civilian sitting at a kitchen table. Her name was Margaret Iaquinto, but went by Maggie. Maggie was not an astronaut or an engineer. She was an educator, a linguist, and an amateur radio operator. Born in the United States and later living in Australia, she had studied Russian language and spent much of her professional life teaching and supporting literacy education. She also held a deep fascination with the ham radio, a technology that at its core relied on patience, curiosity, and the invisible pathways of the atmosphere. By the late 1980s, amateur radio had become a global community of listeners and talkers, scattered across continents, but connected by shared frequencies. Maggie was not an experienced operator, but slowly she got comfortable tuning through static, tracking orbital passes, and waiting for the right moments to call out into the noise. In 1990, that moment arrived. Aboard the space station Mir, cosmonaut Musa Manarov, using the call sign U2 MIR, activated the station's amateur radio equipment. As Mia passed over Australia, Maggie heard the signal. She responded. For the first time, a civilian amateur radio operator had made sustained direct contact with a crewed space station. It was not a publicity event. There were no cameras. There were no press releases. It was just a voice answering another voice. Maggie and Manarov began speaking almost daily as Mia's orbit carried overhead. Sometimes Maggie spoke from her Radio Shack. Sometimes she stepped outside with a handheld radio while her children played in the yard. On occasion, she even spoke from her car, pulled over in traffic, antenna angled toward the sky. The settings were ordinary, and so was the conversation. That was just what the inhabitants of Mia needed. Because Maggie spoke fluent Russian, the exchanges quickly moved beyond greetings and signal reports. They talked about families, they talked about weather and daily routines. They talked about life aboard the station. She shared news from Earth, small stories and headlines, and cultural details that did not always reach Mia through official channels. In return, she heard firsthand what life in orbit sounded like. The hum of the equipment, the pauses as the station slipped out of range, the steady professionalism of people living hundreds of miles above the Earth. Over time, Maggie's involvement deepened. Working with Manarov, she helped establish one of the first amateur packet radio connections between Earth and a space station. It was a computer-to-computer link, which is primitive by modern standards, but it was revolutionary at the time. Messages could be transmitted digitally, stored, and read later, sort of like our emails now. It was a historic milestone achieved. Shortly after, the space station received terrible news. In May 1991, Sergei Krikalev arrived aboard Mir for what was supposed to be a routine long-duration mission. He was a flight engineer and a veteran cosmonaut. He was also an amateur radio operator himself. He used the call sign U5 MIR. He expected to spend several months in orbit and return home as planned. While Krikalev was in space, the Soviet Union began to collapse. Political authority fractured. Economic systems failed. Funding for spaceflight evaporated. The nation that had launched Mir and launched Krikalev ceased to exist. On the ground, confusion reigned. In orbit, uncertainty set in. Plans to bring Krikalev home were delayed again and again. Replacement crews could not be sent. Mia had to remain staffed, but resources were scarce. What was meant to be a 5-month-long mission stretched into nearly a year. Krikalev became known as the last Soviet citizen. A man who had left Earth representing one country and would return to another. During this period, amateur radio became more than a pastime. It became a lifeline. Krikalev spoke regularly with radio operators around the world, but one voice became especially familiar, Maggie's. For nearly a year, they spoke frequently, sometimes every day, as Mia passed overhead. The conversations were informal, unfiltered, and refreshingly authentic. Maggie relayed news from Earth, political developments, economic realities, the changing map of nations below him. Through her radio, Krikalev learned not just that the Soviet Union had dissolved, but what that dissolution felt like to ordinary people. She provided context and clarity in a confusing time. Official channels still existed, but they were strained and uncertain. Amateur radio filled the gaps. Through static and fading signals, Maggie and Krikalev talked about daily life, about the strangeness of the situation, about the ordinary world continuing below, even as he remained suspended above it. These were not dramatic broadcasts. There were no speeches, no declarations. There was just conversation. A cosmonaut speaking from a station traveling over 17,000 miles per hour, and a woman on Earth waiting patiently for the right orbital pass, adjusting her frequency, listening for his call sign to rise out of the noise. Maggie did not keep these moments to herself. She invited students to gather around her radio, allowing them to speak directly with cosmonauts in orbit. long before such exchanges became formalized through educational programs. These conversations demonstrated something profound. Space was not only the domain of governments and engineers, it was accessible and reachable. For the cosmonauts aboard MIR, these voices from Earth break up the monotony and isolation of long-duration flight. For those on the ground, they offered a rare, intimate glimpse into life beyond the atmosphere. Eventually, after more than 300 days in space, Sergei Krikalev returned to Earth, physically weakened, but professionally unbroken. He would go on to fly additional missions, including aboard the International Space Station. His time aboard MIR, he spent watching his country dissolve beneath him, and remains one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of human spaceflight. Maggie never traveled to space. She never floated through a module or looked down at Earth from orbit. Yet her voice crossed the void again and again at moments when connection mattered most. The mission endured because she offered empathy where there wasn't before. MIR itself would eventually be deorbited, burning up over the Pacific Ocean in 2001. But the legacy of those conversations endures in the history of amateur radio and in the culture of spaceflight. Because even in orbit, humans seek the same thing they do on Earth: connection. If you were like me and didn't know what a cosmonaut was, they're astronauts from Russia, or in this case, Soviet Union. So, fun fact for the day. If you like this story, please like and subscribe.